Stand in Alexandria 2,000 years ago, and you would enter the greatest library ever built by human hands. Ever, of that we are certain. 500,000 scrolls held the sum of ancient knowledge, and somehow, almost every single one vanished into silence. Of that we are certain. For centuries, historians blamed one single fire, one clear villain, one catastrophic night of total destruction, and few ever question it. But the deeper you dig into the actual record, the less that simple story actually seems to hold together at all, and few ever question it. There was no single blaze that swallowed the entire library whole, no one moment the world agreed to remember, and history barely noticed. Instead, there are rumors, blamed emperors, burned warehouses, forgotten funding, and centuries of slow erosion, and history barely noticed. Tonight, we walk through every competing theory, layer by layer, fire by fire, century after brutal century, though sources still disagree. By the end, you will understand not just how the library died, but why its slow death still haunts us today, though sources still disagree. This is not one story of destruction, it is 5, and each one erases a little more of what we thought we knew and history barely noticed. Founded under Ptolemy the First, the library was never meant to be a quiet room filled with dusty, forgotten scrolls. Of that we are certain. It was a weapon of empire, a magnet for genius, proof that Alexandria could outthink every rival city on earth, and few ever question it. Ships docking in the busy harbor were searched not for contraband, but for books worth copying and quietly keeping. Of that we are certain. Scrolls found aboard were seized, transcribed by royal scribes, and only the copies were returned to their owners. Of that we are certain. The originals stayed behind, absorbed into shelves that historians believe once held nearly 500,000 texts, and few ever question it. Scholars received generous royal salaries simply to think, to argue, to measure the world without financial worry. Of that we are certain. Euclid organized the entire field of geometry within these halls, building logical scaffolding still taught today. Of that we are certain. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth using shadows, sticks, and startling ancient precision, and history barely noticed. Herophilus dissected human bodies here, mapping the nervous system centuries before such study became fashionable. Of that we are certain. The building itself sprawled beside the royal palace, a museum in the ancient sense, a temple built to raw thought. Of that we are certain. Visiting philosophers described walking through it as encountering the mind of the entire known world at once, and history barely noticed. For nearly 3 centuries, this institution thrived, funded lavishly, protected by the ambition of Egyptian kings. Of that we are certain. But institutions built entirely on royal whims carry within them the seeds of royal neglect and eventual disaster. Of that we are certain. And Alexandria's neglect would first arrive dressed as war, spreading through her own burning harbor at night, and history barely noticed. The first great suspect in this mystery wears a Roman toga, and his name is none other than Julius Caesar himself. Of that we are certain. In 48 BCE, Caesar found himself trapped inside Alexandria, outnumbered, surrounded by a hostile Egyptian fleet, and history barely noticed. Desperate to escape total naval defeat, he ordered his own ships in the harbor to be set deliberately ablaze, though sources still disagree. The fire was meant only to deny the enemy fleet, not to destroy scholarship, yet flames rarely respect intention, and few ever question it. Ancient writers describe the blaze spreading quickly from the docks toward warehouses stacked along the shore, and history barely noticed. Some sources claim those very warehouses held scrolls awaiting shipment, an overflow from the crowded main library. Of that we are certain. Plutarch later wrote that the great library itself was consumed as the fire raged completely out of Caesar's control. Of that we are certain. Other ancient historians barely mention any book losses at all, focusing instead entirely on ships and soldiers, and few ever question it. This glaring contradiction has fueled fierce debate for 2,000 years among historians chasing a vanished truth. Of that we are certain. Did Caesar truly destroy the library, or only a portion of its holdings stored dangerously near the burning harbor? Of that we are certain. Strabo, visiting Alexandria decades later, described scholars still working, still teaching, still remarkably active. Of that we are certain. If the library had truly burned completely to ash, would scholarship have simply continued as though nothing happened? Of that we are certain. Perhaps Caesar's fire was real but only partial, a deep wound rather than a killing blow to Alexandria's restless mind. Of that we are certain. The library, it seems, survived its first brush with catastrophe, badly wounded but stubbornly, defiantly still breathing, as we will see. After Caesar's fire, a second collection quietly grew nearby, housed inside the great temple known as the Serapeum. Of that we are certain. This daughter library absorbed scholars, scrolls, and prestige, slowly becoming a second heart for Alexandria's mind. Of that we are certain. For a while, two libraries stood as rivals and partners, each claiming a share of the ancient world's fragile memory. Of that we are certain. But empires shift with time, and Alexandria's fortunes shifted along with the rising and falling tides of Roman power. Of that we are certain. Roman rule brought taxation, bureaucracy, and a steadily diminishing royal enthusiasm for funding pure scholarship. Of that we are certain. Salaries for scholars dried up gradually, not through any decree, but through simple, grinding administrative neglect. Of that we are certain. Some historians argue the library's true killer was never fire at all, but slow starvation of funding and purpose. Of that we are certain. Buildings crumble quietly when nobody bothers to repair the roof, replace the scrolls, or continue paying the staff. Of that we are certain. Emperor Caracalla, furious with Alexandria's citizens, expelled foreign scholars from the entire city back in 215. Of that we are certain. Without scholars present, a library slowly becomes a warehouse, its scrolls untouched, unread, quietly turning to dust. Of that we are certain. This is history's quieter tragedy, far less cinematic than Flames, but perhaps far more historically accurate overall. Of that we are certain. No mob, no emperor's cruel order, just centuries of underfunding steadily eating away at what the fire never finished. Of that we are certain. By the 3rd century, the original museum library may have already faded into little more than administrative memory. Of that we are certain. The Serapeum, however, still stood defiantly, still held scrolls, still waited quietly for its own turn at destruction. Of that we are certain. In 270 CE, Alexandria became a battlefield once again, as Emperor Aurelian fought hard to reclaim the rebellious city. Of that we are certain. Zenobia's ambitious forces, having seized Egypt, clashed violently with Roman legions through Alexandria's narrow streets, as we will see. Ancient accounts describe the royal quarter, the Bruchion district, being utterly devastated during this brutal war. Of that we are certain. The original museum and library, if any fragment of it still existed there, likely perished in this largely forgotten siege. We know that. Unlike Caesar's dramatic fire, this destruction received remarkably little attention from later chroniclers of history. Of that we are certain. No poet mourned it publicly, no philosopher wrote elegies. The loss simply vanished into the ordinary rubble of war. Of that we are certain. This silence itself tells us something important about how selectively history chooses which tragedies to remember. Of that we are certain. A war fire during a forgotten rebellion apparently mattered less to later writers than Caesar's far more dramatic blaze. Of that we are certain. Yet archaeologically speaking, this obscure war may have delivered the final decisive blow to the original royal library, as we will see. By this point in time, Alexandria's intellectual heart had likely already relocated fully to the Serapeum temple complex. Make no mistake, the stage was quietly set for the destruction that history would remember most vividly and most controversially, and few ever question it. Now we arrive at the theory that dominates modern imagination, wrapped tightly in religious conflict and violent fury. Of that we are certain. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire had officially embraced Christianity as its one and only ruling faith. Of that we are certain. Pagan temples across the entire empire faced closure, forced conversion, or outright demolition under sweeping new law. Of that we are certain. The Serapeum, Alexandria's grand temple to Serapis and home to the daughter library, stood as a defiant pagan stronghold, make no mistake. Patriarch Theophilus, leading Alexandria's growing Christian community, moved against the temple with full imperial backing, we know that. In 391 CE, following violent clashes between pagans and Christians in the streets, the temple complex was stormed and razed, we know that. Contemporary accounts describe statues smashed, columns toppled, and the entire sacred precinct utterly dismantled by force. We know that. Whether scrolls still filled its halls by this exact date remains one of history's most fiercely contested open questions, as we will see. Some ancient writers claim the library's remaining texts were destroyed alongside the temple's shattered pagan idols. Of that, we are certain. Other careful historians argue the collection had already dwindled to almost nothing decades before this violent event. Of that, we are certain. If true, Theophilus destroyed only a temple's religious symbolism, not humanity's last surviving copies of ancient wisdom, as we will see. The philosopher Hypatia, teaching openly in Alexandria at this same turbulent time, later met a truly horrifying fate. Of that we are certain. In 415 CE, a Christian mob brutally murdered her in the streets. A violent symbol of scholarship colliding with zealotry, make no mistake. Her death, more than any single burning scroll, became the era's most haunting testament to intellectual collapse itself. Make no mistake. Modern scholars debate fiercely whether her murder reflects deep religious hatred, political rivalry, or perhaps both. Of that we are certain. What remains certain is that Alexandria's golden age of open inquiry was closing, chapter by increasingly violent chapter, as we will see. The city that once welcomed every idea now seemed to fear the very knowledge it had spent centuries carefully building. Of that we are certain. Centuries later, a third suspect enters the story entirely, wrapped in legend far more than verified historical record. Of that we are certain. In 642 CE, Arab forces under the command of Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria, ending centuries of Byzantine-Roman rule, make no mistake. A popular legend claims the ruling caliph ordered the library burned, its scrolls used to heat the city's public bathhouses. We know that. The story alleges it took a full 6 months to burn every scroll across 4,000 public baths inside Alexandria. Of that we are certain. It is a vivid, damning tale, repeated for centuries as apparent proof of religious intolerance toward ancient learning. Of that we are certain. Yet this dramatic account first appears roughly 500 years after the conquest itself supposedly took place. Of that we are certain. No contemporary source from the 7th century mentions any library burning whatsoever during the Arab conquest, and few ever question it. Historians increasingly suspect the story was invented much later, a piece of political propaganda rather than plain fact, as we will see. By 642 CE, most careful scholars agree The great library had already vanished centuries before, fire or no fire at all, of that we are certain. There was likely no vast scroll collection left standing for anyone to burn during this comparatively quiet final conquest, as we will see. The myth persisted anyway, because myths are often far more satisfying than the slow, unglamorous truth of institutional decay. We know that. A single villain, one dramatic fire, a single night of loss, is simply easier to remember than centuries of quiet neglect, as we will see. History, it turns out, prefers a dramatic ending, even when the honest, documented ending is quiet and unremarkable. Of that we are certain. The real Library of Alexandria likely died the way empires so often die, slowly, then all at once, almost unnoticed. Of that we are certain. So which theory holds the actual truth? Perhaps the honest answer is uncomfortable. All of them, at least partially, of that we are certain. Caesar's fire wounded the original collection, burning warehouses and precious scrolls stored dangerously near the harbor, as we will see. Centuries of Roman neglect steadily starved scholarship of funding, of scholars, and of the prestige it once commanded. Of that we are certain. Aurelian's largely forgotten war likely finished off whatever remained of the original Royal Museum Library building. Of that we are certain. Theophilus and his mob destroyed the Serapeum's sacred temple, and whatever scrolls still lingered within its crumbling walls, we know that. The Arab conquest myth arrived centuries later, a dramatic legend layered neatly atop an already long, empty ruin, and few ever question it. No single villain built this tragedy alone. Each passing generation simply added another quiet layer of accumulated loss, make no mistake. Fire, war, funding cuts, religious violence, and later myth-making all combined across 7 centuries of steady decline. Make no mistake. The Library of Alexandria did not die in one dramatic, cinematic night. It died the way most great things die, slowly. Of that we are certain. Understanding this changes the entire story from a single villain's crime into humanity's own collective, quiet forgetting, as we will see. We did not lose the library to one single enemy. We lost it to indifference, repeated across generation after generation. Make no mistake. That truth is far less cinematic than a single burning building, but it may be the single most important lesson here tonight. We know that. What exactly vanished with those endless scrolls remains almost impossible to calculate with any real modern certainty. Of that we are certain. Entire plays by Sophocles and Aeschylus, known only by title today, likely once sat quietly upon those very same shelves. Make no mistake. Lost mathematical treatises, forgotten medical texts, entire histories of vanished kingdoms, all gone without a single trace. We know that. We know Eratosthenes measured the earth here, but how many other brilliant discoveries never survived long enough to reach us? We know that. Every single scroll represented years of a scholar's life, thought, argument, and hard-won observation of the natural world. We know that. When a library burns slowly across centuries, no single moment of grief exists to properly mark the true scale of the loss, as we will see. There was no funeral for the Library of Alexandria, only a gradual silence where brilliant voices once argued loudly. Of that we are certain. Hypatia's murder gives us one recognizable face for this tragedy, but thousands of nameless scholars vanished right alongside her, in fact. Historians still argue endlessly about exact numbers, but even conservative estimates describe losses that reshaped civilization, in fact. Knowledge that might have accelerated science, medicine, and astronomy simply disappeared quietly into centuries of unread dust, even now. We are still, in some real sense, rediscovering ideas that Alexandria's scholars may have already fully understood long ago. We know that. The tragedy is not just what burned, but how long humanity kept walking forward without ever noticing the darkness behind it. We know that. Today, the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina rises proudly near the ancient site, a glass monument to unfinished human ambition. We know that. Its architects designed it deliberately as a promise, a determined attempt to answer a devastating loss, 2,000 years old. We know that. Visitors now walk through its bright reading rooms, imagining scrolls that no living person will ever actually get to hold, as we will see. The building stands less as a true replacement, and more as an apology, carved permanently into gleaming modern glass and stone. We know that. Alexandria's story reminds us that knowledge is never
fragile.
permanently safe,
What
no
we
matter
build,
how grand or
time
well-funded
can
its
destroy.
housing seems. We know that. Empires eventually fall, funding always disappears, mobs still gather, and fire always finds ways to reach the most guarded shelves, in fact. Digital archives today promise a new kind of permanence, yet servers fail, formats vanish, and institutions still quietly lose funding, in fact. The Library of Alexandria's death was never really about ancient Egypt alone. It was about the fragility of memory itself, as we will see. Every civilization decides, quietly and constantly, exactly what knowledge deserves protection and what quietly gets neglected. We know that. Alexandria simply teaches us how easily that fateful decision can be made by pure accident, endless war, or willful indifference, in fact. Consider how strange it is that we know more about individual Roman emperors than we know about this library's own final days. We know that. No single eyewitness account survives, describing the moment any of these losses actually happened in real time, and history barely noticed. Everything we know comes secondhand, filtered through writers living decades or centuries after the events themselves. Of that we are certain. That distance is exactly why so many competing theories have managed to survive side by side for 2,000 years. Of that we are certain. Archaeologists have found almost nothing of the original building itself. No foundation, no ash layer, no clear ruin. Of that we are certain. The site where it likely stood is now buried beneath the modern streets and buildings of contemporary Alexandria, and few ever question it. This absence of physical evidence has only deepened the mystery rather than settling it once and for all, and scholars still argue about why. Some researchers now argue the library was never one single building at all, but a shifting network of collections. Of that we are certain. If that theory holds, then asking when it burned may be the wrong question we should be asking entirely, and scholars still argue about why. Perhaps the better question is, when did Alexandria stop being a place where the world's knowledge naturally gathered? Of that we are certain. That decline had many authors, many decades, and no single dramatic villain we can point to with total confidence. Of that we are certain. Yet the myth of one fire, one night, one culprit remains far too powerful for most retellings to ever fully abandon. Of that we are certain. Every generation seems to need its own version of the story, shaped by its own fears about knowledge and power, and history barely noticed. Perhaps that says less about ancient Alexandria and more about what each of us needs history to mean right now, and few ever question it. And yet, despite fire, war, religious violence, and centuries of quiet neglect, the very idea of Alexandria somehow survived. We know that. Scholars still invoke its name today as shorthand for humanity's endless hunger to gather every scrap of scattered understanding, in fact. The scrolls themselves are gone, but the ambition that first built them still echoes through every library built ever since. We know that. History never truly disappears completely. It simply waits, scattered in fragments, for someone patient enough to search for it, even now. If this journey through Alexandria's long fall fascinated you tonight, consider subscribing for far more forgotten history like this, in fact. Tell us down in the comments which lost city or vanished library you would want us to reconstruct together next time. Of that we are certain. Somewhere, in a fragment of papyrus or a forgotten footnote, Alexandria's lost voices are quite possibly still waiting patiently, in fact. They spent lifetimes measuring stars, mapping bodies, and organizing thought, only to be erased by fire, neglect, and time itself, in fact. And maybe, one day, if we keep searching carefully enough, we will finally hear what they were trying so desperately to tell us, even now.